Good morning, good day, and good evening. Welcome back to Tech Over Tea. I'm, as always, your host, Rudy Robertson, and today we have a very interesting guest. Today we have a developer, the developer of OpenRGB. Welcome to the show, Adam Holtz, better known as CalcProgrammer1.
Nice to be here.
I didn't actually. So I've known about your software for a really long time. I feel like a lot of people knew about your software, but I don't think.
Mhm.
I don't think a lot of people know about the person behind it. You obviously do have the YouTube channel, but it's not like, it's not a
Mhm.
massive channel, and you do talk about
Yeah.
things there, but I think
Mhm.
everyone's heard about OpenRGB in the Linux space, but in case anyone hasn't, just give a brief introduction of what it actually is.
So OpenRGB is trying to be like a single program to unify all the RGB devices. So by RGB devices, I'm talking about pretty much everything in the gaming community, the gaming PC world these days comes with RGB, programmable lights, keyboards. I've got like mice, anything like RAM, graphics cards. Yeah, you've got one there.
Cool.
Microphone, even my headphones, RGB. So basically, I've kind of been into the RGB scene for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I actually got into it, and that's why I have this here. Um, Back basically when I was learning how to program, one of the
Mm-hmm.
things I wanted to do was get into microcontrollers.
Okay.
And the first project I did was in like 2009, and I made this RGB PC fan. So uh, there were
Oh,
no
wait.
commercially available.
Oh, wait.
Yeah, so I've
Okay.
been into this for a while. I actually made like this instructable on it. This was like 2010 or something. So I made my own like RGB fan, and I had learned how to like write code and make it do effects and animations, and I made like a music visualizer for it. But then whenever like the RGB craze really took off commercially
Mm.
and all the real products started coming out, um, then I was still interested in this idea because I had already written all this code for RGB, and I was like, wouldn't it be cool if I could, have my keyboard react to music or my everything in my computer all like synchronized? And so I had no idea how to reverse engineer stuff at the time. I wasn't familiar with that. I had a familiarity with hardware,
Mm-hmm.
but as an embedded software developer, but not in like the reverse engineering type thing. So I kind of learned how to do that to reverse engineer like the first Corsair keyboard that came out,
Mm-hmm.
and ported my code to that. So then several years later, I had really built up a full PC full of RGB stuff. And it was getting to the point where everyone was complaining, if I buy a Corsair this, a Razer this, an
Mm-hmm.
Asus this, a Gigabyte this, and G-Skill RAM and a ARM motherboard and all
Mm-hmm.
this
Mm-hmm.
stuff, and none of it works with each other. And then you've got these programs that require sign-in. Like Razer was the ecosystem that I fell into for a while, partly because they sponsored my visualizer program for a little while, sent me
Mm-hmm.
some free stuff. So I was into their ecosystem, had a lot of Razer stuff. And their program is especially bad because you actually have to sign in. You have to create a user account to log into Razer Synapse, and
I'm
it's
guessing
so
it's so they can
annoying.
sync it between computers. Is that their justification?
That's what their stated goal is. Like we
Mm-hmm.
can synchronize your mouse settings or whatever
Right,
from
right.
PCA to
Because
PCB.
as we all
But
know, gamers like to drag their gaming gear between a
yeah,
bunch of computers.
right. But like they could have just put memory on the mouse and
Yeah,
say
yeah.
so.
Like
Yeah, like
it
every
probably
other
wait.
brand
It probably
did.
has memory on the mouse already, doesn't it?
It probably does. Yeah, I think it does. But they're like, no, you gotta sign in to be able to change the DPI on your mouse, or
Mm-hmm.
pick which color your mouse is. And so I was getting increasingly fed up with their software and everyone else's software, and it wasn't all syncing together.
Mm-hmm.
And for a while, I was just doing like Corsair and Razer, and both of those had like an official SDK from the
Oh,
manufacturers.
do they?
So you could write your own applications that talk to those devices.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah, there was an official SDK, still is for Razer and Corsair, several of
Uh,
the others as well.
Corsair IQ SDK. Huh. I didn't know
Hmm.
that. That's actually really cool.
Yeah, And Razer had the Chroma SDK for a while there
Okay,
too. I
okay.
think that's still around. It's mainly it was for like games to be able to do like game RGB
Right.
effects while you're playing games. But Razer was pushing the community stuff big whenever they started their SDK. That's
Mhm.
how I kind of got involved with it. Um, but then several years passed and more stuff didn't have an SDK, especially like the internal parts, like the motherboards, the GPUs, and those things started becoming more and more popular as I was building a newer computer, upgrading. So yeah, I could sync my keyboard and my mouse, but not my RAM, not my GPU,
Right.
not my motherboard. And so that kind of, I was still working on the visualizer project mainly, which was mostly focused on Windows.
Mhm.
Um, but then we kind of went through this process. It was like a 100 comment GitHub thread where we were just trying to figure out how Asus Ara communicated with a chip on the motherboard that controlled the lights. There was like oscilloscope probing involved. I was like poking pins on the back of the RAM socket with an oscilloscope, trying to find the I squared C lines and decode the data. So we figured out that at least the RAM was controlled by I squared C,
Mhm.
and then we kind of went down from there. And after like probably a month of comments from a whole bunch of different people and capturing data from all these different boards, we started to figure out the pieces kind of falling in place of
Mhm.
how the interface for Asus Ara worked, which at that time it was I squared C.
Mhm.
Um, and the problem is on Windows, there is no like I squared C framework. Like on Linux, there's dev I squared C.
Dev I squared
And
C.
yeah, /dev /I squared C. If you
I
have the
how you
module
spell it?
load,
Sorry, I.
I2C. So
Oh,
I squared C or
oh, okay. No, I
I2C.
know what this is. Okay, yeah. Okay, I've heard of
Mm-hmm.
this.
Yeah, it's like a low level
Yep.
interface
Okay.
for chips. Yeah.
Yeah, you kept saying I squared C in your video, and I had
Uh
no idea what
huh.
you were talking about. But no, this I have heard of. Okay.
Yeah, it's stands for inter-integrated circuit,
Mm-hmm.
but it's and you spelled out I2C, but everyone
Yep.
calls it I squared C. Or I've seen IIC, I2C, I squared C,
Right.
or
Okay.
TWI, two wire interface. All of those are the same name for the same thing, basically.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, we figured out that it was I squared C, but Windows doesn't have I squared C drivers.
Mm-hmm.
So what we did is we used like a low-level access library on Windows that you can actually talk to low-level registers with, and then copied the Linux source code for the I squared C drivers and ported them to use that library on Windows. It worked.
Mm-hmm.
It was a big hack, but it seems like that's just how you access I squared C in Windows. It's a big hack. Um, but from there, we were able to finally get some RGB control going on Linux,
Mm-hmm.
which was pretty cool. That was a big kind of wow, we got this to work moment. And so at that point, I was like, okay, I've got keyboard, mouse, and at least on Linux, keyboard and mouse, there was already a project called OpenRGB that,
Yep.
yeah, that got the RGB working for Razer devices. Then
Uh,
there was a project called CKB Next for Corsair.
when did you start doing this? What do you remember roughly when?
The reverse engineering effort for the Ara was in like 2017.
Oh, okay.
When Ryzen first gen first came out, because that's when I did a
Okay.
big
Yep.
upgrade. But then we did the reverse engineering, and then I just didn't go anywhere with it for like 2 years.
Right.
We had figured it out, but I was like, I didn't know how I wanted to turn it into an actual project or actual code or anything.
Mm-hmm.
And I was busy with other stuff. So then I finally sat down in 2019, and I had some free time, and I was like, I want to create like just an application to control the Asus Ara motherboard and
Mm-hmm.
RAM in Linux or in Windows, um, because I was just that was the code that we kind of figured out, but we
Mm-hmm.
hadn't written any actual code around yet, other than
Right.
just some proof of concept. So I started a project called OpenRA SDK,
Mm-hmm.
and that was just it was a fairly little project. I got it to where you could just set the modes for your RAM, your motherboard, just very limited scope. It was just Asus Ara I2C devices,
Mhm.
and it really only worked on certain motherboards because they're like certain motherboards had different configurations,
Ah.
and I didn't know how to understand how those configurations worked.
Mhm.
So I put it on GitLab, and I was like, we'll see if anyone's interested. So I posted on Reddit a few times, and
Mhm.
I don't even think I made a YouTube video about it. I just kind of posted it on Reddit, posted it on some forums,
Mhm.
and said, hey, if you're looking for, so people were saying, how do I control my motherboard lights in Linux? And I said, well, you could try this. And um, after that, after probably 6 months or so, interest had picked up and people were commenting and people were submitting captures from their own motherboards, and we were able to compare, contrast these different captures and try and kind of figure out, okay, we got a lot better picture of how this ARA interface worked whenever
Mhm.
we could see how all these different motherboards kind of interacted with it. We got it working on Intel, we got it working on AMD, because they have different chipsets for I2C.
Okay, right, that makes sense.
Because like the I2C host side is part of the chipset, like
Right.
the Intel or AMD chipset,
Right, so
and then
even if
on
it's basically
certain,
like equivalent boards on AMD and Intel, it's still going to work differently.
yeah. So basically, because it's integrated circuit, so
Mhm.
the ARA RGB controller chip was the same across the different boards,
Right.
but the host side was like the Intel chipset
Mhm.
versus the AMD chipset. And then on certain boards, they even had like the Nuvoton Super IO
Mhm.
has an I2C controller, and they were using that to communicate with the RGB. So there were like three different potential host interfaces that we had to figure out.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so we kind of sorted through that mess and figured it out. But long story short, we got it to a good working state. And from that point, people were saying, well, what about Gigabyte? What about Corsair? What about ASRock and all these other brands? And it's like, well, my project was pretty laser focused on just Asus Ara,
Mhm.
but I also had Razer keyboard and Corsair mouse, and I had a Gigabyte GPU and a bunch of other parts, but that I would like to have everything integrated
Mhm.
together.
Mhm.
So I thought, what would it take to expand the project from just focusing on Asus Ara to um, let's control everything? Why not just control everything? Because that would be the goal, is just synchronize all your lighting and make it all work from one place. So the first kind of step there was to write kind of an API
Mhm.
of like drill down what is an RGB device at its core? What are the functions it can have? What are the configurations it can have? What parameters does it take?
Mhm.
And how can we make this interface as generic as possible? And so I came up with something I called RGB controller API.
Okay.
And that's kind of an internal thing in the OpenRGB code base. And so for a while, I was just working that in a branch and still focusing on the Asus Ara stuff. But the idea was then I bought some like Corsair RAM,
Mhm.
and I tried to figure out how that worked. And since we already kind of figured out how I squared C worked, and we understand that I squared C is what's used to access RAM, well, now that we have that low level interface figured out, it was a lot easier now to reverse engineer Corsair, HyperX, a
Right.
bunch of other brands of RAM, because we knew kind of how it all worked. And yeah, the protocols were different, but we had written some tools to like get captures of
Mhm. Mhm.
data and kind of how to read back the registers after you've written to them and see what the values were. We just kind of knew the process.
Mhm.
So we kind of went through and added a bunch of popular components at the time, ones that I just pick up as I went. Um, and then after that, we just kind of went into even more stuff. We figured out how to talk to graphics cards, starting with NVIDIA. We wrote a library to kind of capture I squared C transfers from NVIDIA cards
Okay.
that uses the NV API,
Mhm.
their API. Um, and so we just kind of went from there. Just whenever like there was some new product, I'd just go see, oh, it's on sale at Micro Center. I'll buy some new RGB things to reverse engineer, and So we did some keyboards, some mice, so all of it was reverse engineered. So we got really good at reverse engineering different things, whether it's graphics cards, USB, I2C, and then writing, like figuring out the protocols and then re-implementing them.
Mm-hmm.
And so as we got bigger, as we got more code, then more and more people seemed like they were starting to contribute their own work. And then OpenRGB also, especially in the early iterations, borrowed quite heavily from like OpenRazor and
Right, right.
CKB
Well, yeah,
Next.
you might as
And
well use the things that already
yeah,
exist.
yeah, we studied a lot of that other open source projects. So there's on the OpenRGB GitLab README, there's a
Mm-hmm.
whole bunch of other projects that I've linked to that were
Mm-hmm.
either directly used or like heavily inspired from.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we definitely drew on the works of existing open source software where we could. Um, and that trend continued far into OpenRGB's development. There's like an open source library for like Philips Hue light bulbs,
Okay.
like the whole lighting ecosystem. OpenRGB now supports that because
Oh,
I leverage
wow.
this other project. So yeah, we just kind of uh, grew from there, and then the community involvement became pretty big. Like once the project started taking off, again, I was posting on Reddit and forum threads. I made a YouTube video showing off my setup, and that drew some attention to the project. And people started. I'd Google search OpenRGB, and I'd start seeing like people were talking about it, and it's like, oh, that's cool. And so I'd jump in and talk about it with them, and so that meant contributions to the GitLab started growing, and so it got to a point where there's a whole bunch of supported devices now. It just seems like every day there's new merge requests being open to add more devices, and so that's really cool. Um,
So when we look
so
at
yeah, that's
the obviously like a bunch of other people have like getting involved with the project now, but
mm-hmm.
how much, if you don't mind me asking, how much have you spent on buying devices that you want to get working?
Oh, I would say probably it's probably a few thousand at this
Mm-hmm.
point. Um, it's been picked up over probably 3 or 4 years worth
Right.
of time. I was kind of going, every day, every month, I'd spend like, maybe $50 to $100 on a new device if I
Mm-hmm.
could to have something to reverse engineer, at least in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And then there were some big purchases. We ran into some roadblocks. It wasn't all like perfect and happy. There were some issues, especially regarding MSI motherboards.
Mm-hmm.
Those RGB controllers had a tendency to brick themselves if you sent the wrong data to them. And in our second release, I personally didn't have an MSI motherboard to test on. I had just merged some other code that people submitted, and other
Mm-hmm.
people said, "Oh, this works." But then when after release, people were saying, "Oh, my RGB got bricked." So we had to. I pulled that back. I commented that out and disabled it,
Mm-hmm.
and then it sat disabled for a while because we didn't want to brick boards. But I knew that I wanted to get it working, and more importantly, I wanted to figure out how we could unbrick those boards.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the first like larger purchases, I mean, it was only maybe 200 or 300 for a motherboard, but that was more than like the keyboards and mice that I'd been buying up to that point.
Right.
But at the same time, people had started to contribute on Patreon or whatever, PayPal and Patreon. So I had some donations coming in, which I was able to go buy an MSI board and rebuild my PC with that board so that I could, one, test the code that we had
Mm-hmm.
and figure out, okay, and then I reproduced the bricking issue. So I bricked the board, but then I noticed that the chip that was driving the RGB was like a Nuvoton ARM microcontroller.
Mm-hmm.
So I bought one of their like JTAG interface dongles, and I had dumped the firmware from it, and then I figured out where their like configuration memory was, and I wiped it, and that's managed to recover the chip, get it working again. So I was able to post some guides on our Discord about how to do that
Mm-hmm.
and get the board up and working again. And then we were able to figure out what the issue was in the software that was causing the brick. And now MSI boards are pretty well supported in OpenRGB since then. And actually, I'm using one right now. So
have you run into any
turned out
situations
pretty good.
where something was bricked, whether it's a board or a keyboard, and it just there was no way that you could work out how to recover it. It was just e-waste at that point.
There have been some bricks that unfortunately I don't have the hardware to
Right.
reverse engineer and try and figure out at this point.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that was supported were like there's a whole bunch of low cost keyboards on the market, RGB keyboards,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of them have really terrible firmware. There for a while there were ones called eVision, and that was like the dominant chip in the you wouldn't find any keyboard labeled eVision, but
Right.
it was the chip that was being used in a lot of them. So ones from like Red Dragon were using these chips.
I have a Red Dragon keyboard sitting in the cupboard right now.
Yeah. So those actually turned out to be okay because I actually found that some other people were trying to port QMK to this chip, like the open source keyboard firmware.
Okay.
Yeah, so I joined in on that project and wrote like an LED driver to get the backlights working and got them working in OpenRGB once that project kind of came together. I did a YouTube video about that, about how to put like custom firmware on the Red Dragon keyboards. And actually they went from being cheap, kind of bad keyboards to actually being, at least from a software perspective, very nice keyboards once you had good firmware on them. And then what did Red Dragon do? They went and they switched the chip out because on the same product lines. It was,
I'm
to be
guessing
fair, it was
without a
when
rename
COVID
then?
happened. No rename. I mean, it was whenever the supply chain issues started happening.
Okay, that makes sense.
They went to a cheaper chip, and it was a completely different architecture, and the firmware was completely different. And so, for whatever reasons, some of those keyboards would brick, and so I had to pull the support for that controller in OpenRGB, just take it out so that it wasn't bricking keyboards. But unfortunately, I think a lot of people who had those keyboards ran into a bricking issue with them. And because they're so cheap and Red Dragon doesn't have any documentation or firmware, we weren't able to figure out. I did end up eventually getting one, and I got a programmer for it, but I haven't had a chance to like dump the firmware from it. So hopefully we can figure out a way to recover those. But I think my takeaway from that is to stay away from like the really cheap boards. Get something that has decent firmware. I mean, if it has a good, well, even if it's a bloated, ugly piece of software for Windows, at least it has some sort of software that we can take advantage of, and some sort of firmware we can take advantage of that's not going to be really terrible.
Well, Red Dragon's a really interesting company. I'm sure there are other ones like it, but this is a Logitech G915. This is a really nice keyboard. I like this. Yeah. My other keyboard is from Red Dragon is a identical clone of this without the Logitech logo. Like, they know what they're doing. They know the market they're trying to get into. They make these, like, this is at full price, this is like a $300 keyboard in Australia. I bought it half price, but the Red Dragon one is it's like $80, and it does 90% of what this does. So if you're someone who's like looking for a keyboard, like, they've managed to fit themselves into that market without making keyboards that are so terrible they just fall apart. They get most of the way there.
Build quality is decent. And well, whenever we had the ability to flash the custom firmware to them, I was really liking Red Dragon. I would recommend them any day of the week because their keyboards were like $30 to $40 here in the US compared to like the $80 or $90 to $100 like Razors and Corsairs, Logitechs. And their build quality was pretty decent. Like the K556 I had, metal construction, swappable key switches, all kinds of stuff. It was a pretty nice keyboard. Just I was hindered by the firmware that came on the microcontroller inside of it. If you wanted to use it for OpenRGB, but once we put custom firmware on there, it really made a nice keyboard. So I was really disappointed whenever they did the microcontroller swap because now they're pretty useless for OpenRGB. Although this keyboard is an AOC that I just picked up.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't even know they made keyboards, but then I saw it at Micro Center, and it was like a $30, $25 to $30 keyboard. And I thought, this is just going to be some like Red Dragon-ish Chinese, like, well, they're all Chinese probably, but low quality chip. And from like SinoWealth is the chip that is infamous for being bricked on that particular chip. Like the eVision was good, the SinoWealth is bad. I thought it was just gonna be that, but no, it actually turned out to be like they have their own software ecosystem, and they have like they can sync the different devices. And whenever they do that, that's good for us because that means it's going to have an interface to control the keys from software directly. And it turned out to be that. And this is actually a really good board for that price. So I've been super happy with this board.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a AOC. I think it's a GK 500 or something like that.
I'm not in the market for a new keyboard. If someone wants to grab one and wants to, mess around with it, hey, it's supported OpenRGB now, so.
Yep. I mean, I have much nicer keyboards than this, but for the price, I'm pretty happy with this one. So
going all the way back to the start, where you were talking about making your own RGB fan, I presume the way that you approach that is a lot more sane than the way that some of these companies try to approach their protocols.
At the time, I was like just getting into microcontroller development, so I wasn't super familiar with protocols. It was kind of a learning experience. But I think what I ended up coming up with was closer to what is like really being used than I would have thought. Because I actually kind of inspired my communication protocol on I2C, even though it's not actually I2C. It's like half duplex serial. But I used an addressing scheme where each device has a different address. The idea was that I could have multiple of these in my computer. I built 3 of these, and I had 3 of them in my computer, and then they all connected together to one serial port. And that scheme is very similar to how I2C works, where every chip on the bus has its own address, and you can talk to each one individually. So in the end, this like early development thing that I made as a college project actually turned out to be kind of closer to the real thing that is out there now than I had originally thought. So, but
well, okay. When over the time you've been doing this, what has been? I'm going to do both sides. What has been the easiest device you've come across, and then what has been the hardest device you've come across?
Okay. Easiest
obviously
device.
Easiest kind of difficult because you've gotten methods now, like, so it's a lot easier to do devices than it would have been in like the early days, but yeah,
so I would say the easiest device, well, the hardest device, I mean, you're right on that, is going to be the very first thing we reverse engineered because we had no idea what we were doing. But if I had to go for a hard device these days, knowing how to reverse engineer stuff, it would basically be, I would probably say anything that had a protocol that uses some kind of CRC or checksum or other like integrity message. Because decoding, like you can look for R, G, and B in a packet stream pretty easily. And you can look for the modes changing when you change the modes or the speeds or the brightness or anything like that. But when you see some values that just kind of randomly change every time the message updates, and you don't know why, your guess is that's going to be some kind of CRC, checksum, some kind of integrity code. But how is that calculated? That's the hard part. Like you have to look at that and go, okay, which format is this calculated on? Luckily, there are some online calculators where you can just paste in a string of bytes, and it'll give you like all the different types of like 20 or 30 different types of integrity checks, like CRC 16, 32. There's a bunch of different algorithms, like hashing algorithms that you could use to produce some kind of integrity code. A lot of them are really easy. You just like add all of the bytes together and take, the remainder of that or something like that. But sometimes they're not as easy. And that was something I ran into with this particular keyboard, is it had a very strange CRC, and
Mhm.
I still don't even know if I'm actually doing it right, but it's working. So
Hasn't
um,
bricked yet.
yeah, it hasn't bricked, and it's actually takes the update. So either they ignore the CRC or I'm calculating it correctly. But we've run into some of those before where you have to calculate some kind of verification code based on the packet
Mhm.
before you send it.
I can
Um,
see why you would have like a simple verification, but why you do anything more complex than that? I don't
yeah,
know what the engineers would be thinking when they were designing that.
yeah. So that's just something I can think of running into that kind of makes you think a little bit like, what is this actually doing?
Mhm.
But then easiest thing to reverse engineer by far would have to be anything that has documentation.
Right,
And
right,
that
right.
leads us into the next topic. But even if it's not like official documentation, this is where like going back and using OpenRazor or
Mhm.
CKB Next,
Yep,
or
yep.
there were like G801 LED for Logitech keyboards. There were a bunch of open source projects, and Liquid CTL is another one.
Mhm, mhm.
Going through and gleaning information from these other projects, because they've already done the reverse engineering, and a lot
Mhm.
of them like had GitHub wikis and such that
Mhm,
they
mhm.
actually documented out their protocols.
Oh
And
wow.
that's something I was doing, at least for OpenRGB, especially in the early days, was I was maintaining the GitHub or GitLab wiki with all the protocol documentation. Like I was writing my own documentation. I haven't been as good about that more recently, but in the early days, that was a big help to
Mhm.
kind of learn how to do things. And having that documentation from people who had already done it was a huge help.
Mhm.
So yeah, I would say that the easiest would be by far anything with documentation.
Mm.
So
Oh, that feels like a cop out answer to me, but sure, we'll go with it.
well, okay, if I had to pick one, unfortunately, so I will give you one that the company actually reached out and contacted me. This was actually fairly early on,
Mhm, mhm,
and it was HyperX,
mhm.
before they got bought out by HP or split up. It was their RAM division. I had posted on Reddit that I was making OpenRGB. I think I posted it on the HyperX subreddit.
Mhm.
And they reached out to me and said, "Oh, we find this very interesting. We'd like to send you a kit of Fury DDR4 RAM." And they also sent me the protocol documentation for it.
Mhm.
Now, the problem is I had already reverse engineered it and had it mostly working. But
Mhm.
being able to look through their actual official documentation and confirm that I was doing the right thing,
Right.
and then fill in the gaps where I was unsure,
Mhm, mhm.
that made it way easier. And so that RAM became one of the most supported RAM that
Mhm.
is in OpenRGB.
Mhm.
So I that is probably the example of like well supported because of documentation, even though
Right.
they were kind of delayed. The only other ones would be some of the like smart lighting stuff, like Philips
Okay.
Hue and um, I think LIFX,
Mhm.
because those companies actually have like developer documentation on their websites.
Yeah, it's almost like they
Because
want you to
those,
control the lights.
yeah, like the lights, the smart lighting people tend to be a little bit more open about that because they want the third party apps to integrate with their devices. But the RGB PC stuff generally, they
Mhm.
have not been that open. So
Mm. Well,
um,
I guess that does
yeah,
take us into OpenPleb then. Um,
yes, it does.
the initiative from Wendell and Gamers Nexus. I did a video about this. I
Hmm.
think it's really cool.
Yeah, I saw your video. Yep.
Yeah, oh, yeah, you did comment on it, didn't you? Um,
Hmm.
so for anyone who may have missed that, I guess just explain what the goal is here and like what the effect would be.
So, from what I've understand from their initiative,
Mhm.
Open Pleb is the collaboration between Wendell from at Level One Techs and Steve from Gamers Nexus, and they want to create. I think it's a company, like a sort of a company structure, maybe a nonprofit. I'm not
I
100%
believe
sure
it
on
is a
the
non-profit,
details there.
yes.
Yeah. And they're trying to mimic some of the ideas that are done in like the professional space, where I guess in the professional space, and I'm not super in tune with that space, but there are standards groups that try and get all the different computer companies to open up documentation about how their components work. I think this is very common in like the server and enterprise computing space. And that's the kind of space where you'd expect more in-house development to be running on hardware, maybe more so than you would in like the consumer level. Us plebs, according to that's why they call it open pleb, for like PC hardware and consumer level stuff. So the goal of open pleb would be to get that sort of documentation and openness for community developers and end user development to for us plebs down in the PC community who aren't big enterprise level companies. But so yeah, the idea is to try and work with all the different manufacturers, and they said that they were starting with RGB, but also like sensors, power supplies, probably like the LCD screens that are showing up on all kinds of devices.
Oh yeah, that's the thing
days.
as well, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and not only software but also hardware, because now we've got like Corsair coming out with new fan connectors. You've got like Lian Li, who has those fans that connect together. Everyone seems to have their own proprietary plug that has like 12-volt PWM fan and ARGB combined into some proprietary plug. And so if you wanted standardization between like being able to choose which fans you put in your PC based on which controller it has built into the case or that you've added on, having some sort of standard there would help. But everyone's already kind of locked into their proprietary ecosystem, it seems already, unfortunately. But at very least, if they would provide us with documentation to tell us how it all works, maybe we won't have the intercompatibility of being able to pick and choose different parts. But from a software perspective and as an OpenRGB developer, we would have what we need to write standardized interfaces for all these different components and then kind of get them all grouped together in one place in OpenRGB or any other like common software ecosystem. Other ones that I've thought about would be like libratbag for mice.
Yeah. I'm a big Logitech guy. I've got a lot of Logitech mice. Libratbag works great for that, but there are a lot of other mice out there where not so much.
I know I thought that they have support for some that aren't Logitech.
No, they definitely do, but it's a lot. Yeah. It's a lot more hit and miss.
Right. So the hope would be that, you know, without more documentation, they could expand their
exactly. Yeah.
And also like lib sensors, the API for accessing sensors on Linux was a big point there. And I know that a lot of motherboards, because I've been buying motherboards for OpenRGB, I've run into this too. Like not all motherboards have proper reporting of like fan RPM and voltages and temperatures, because that's often handled by a super IO chip. And one thing that they talked about was Nuvoton, and I said I ran into Nuvoton from the I2C communicating with RGB controllers, and they have some documentation, like some of their chips have data sheets, and then some of them do not. And so I think they might be like certain manufacturers like request custom versions of their Super IO chips that don't get documented, and some like do get public documentation. But it would be nice if all that documentation was open, because having the ability to read the fan speed on your motherboard is pretty nice.
Yeah, that is pretty useful, yeah.
Yeah. So
one thing with the whole RGB thing is, I know there's a lot of people out there who don't like RGB, like full stop. But even for those people, this would be useful because it gives you the ability to disable the lights if you don't want them.
Yes, you know, OpenRGB is nice because I can just stop all effects, and then I can just right click and I can do lights off.
Exactly.
Lights off.
Oh,
and if you're an anti-RGB person and you want this, well, OpenRGB can give you this.
Exactly.
If your RAM powers up and it's just rainbows. Like I do like setting everything that I can to start up off and then just do my effects when I want them with OpenRGB.
Right.
I don't like whenever I power up my computer and it's just immediate rainbows. Like that's not the best use of RGB, but that's what everyone goes for. Like the default is crazy rainbows in your face as soon as you hit the power button. And we can turn them off with OpenRGB. And if we have standards, we can turn them all off.
Well, look, there's another way to turn them off without documentation. You just brick every light.
Well, not when we did the MSI boards, because they would brick and then they just sit there and flicker constantly.
Okay,
so maybe not. Now duct tape.
That'll work, yeah.
Putting up black paint over the LEDs. I've heard those as options before.
Exactly. Yeah, that'll work.
I like my solution better.
Oh yeah, no, documentation.
Reversible.
Yeah, that would be nice. Yeah, documentation would be nice. So I did see that there was a company that got in contact with, got in contact with you directly, or was just post about the initiative on Twitter?
They did post about the initiative on Twitter. That was Height.
Yeah, I'd not heard of this brand, but looking at some of the stuff they've done, they actually seem like a relatively known about brand. Like, obviously they're a small one, but even so.
They're a small brand from what I've seen. I had heard about them from one of Steve's videos. He had covered at least one of their cases, maybe a few of their cases, like sometime last year.
But they have done some partnerships with some fairly big brands as well.
Yeah. But yeah, I'd never used any of their products, and I didn't even know that they were really in the RGB space, because it looked like the cases that they do have don't have RGB. But I think from the Computex coverage, I think they might be starting to make some new ones that do have RGB and RGB controllers and fans and stuff. But the product that I saw that is on their website now at the time that you can buy right now is they have their own full-size desk mat.
Okay.
And it actually has like full RGB. So I have one for Brazer that it's basically just a little box at the top that shines light around a light pipe that goes all the way around. But theirs like actually has embedded LEDs throughout the pad. So that was kind of interesting to see that. How did they do that in a flexible kind of mat?
I always forget that there are RGB mouse pads now.
Yeah, there are a lot of RGB. If there's anything computer related, someone has put RGB in it. That's just, there's RGB chairs. There's RGB like.
I'm trying to think. Is there anything that doesn't have? Has anyone made RGB cables?
I'm pretty sure they exist, but I don't know if any of the big brands have them or if they're software controllable. I know that there are ones that just go through like a pre-made pattern, because you can just stick those self-changing LEDs into a cable, like a USB cable. But yeah, there's Leanne Lee made the Strimmer, whatever they are, the GPU like power cables. They're like the flexible power extension cables,
right?
And they basically are just an LED matrix over the entire cable.
Oh god, it is. Okay. Yeah, I see.
I forgot about those. Yeah. So yes, RGB cables has been.
Do they have software that controls that?
I'm not sure on that one. From what I've read, I think it connects to like an ARGB header.
Okay. But
I don't have one of those to experiment with.
Yeah, there is a cable that comes off of it, so it connects to. Yeah. So it's probably controlled by something.
Yeah, I think you have to connect it to like an external ARGB controller or a motherboard or something like that. So, yeah, but yeah, it exists.
Yeah, I can't think of anything that doesn't then, because there's. Yeah, no. Well, I guess, no one's. Has anyone made a replacement, what do you call it, like, heat spreader for a CPU that has RGB on it? Because that's the only part I think. I think CPU is the only thing.
The heat spreader itself, like the literal CPU, no, but definitely coolers, water blocks.
Yeah. I think CPU is the only things that don't have RGB at this point.
That is true. Like there's RGB SSDs. There's RGB.
Wait, is there?
I have an external hard drive with RGB.
Well, that makes sense. Sure. This RGB has the best RGB we've ever seen. Okay, sure. Thank you, Hardware Canucks. Oh my God, there are. I
So
didn't know that.
yes.
Like when I'm shopping for an SSD, I'm not looking for lighting because like my SSD
No.
is probably gonna go on the back of the case between the metal panel and the mother where the motherboard sits. I'm literally never gonna see it,
You're
but
never gonna see it, right?
hey, if someone wants to make it, I guess they can.
Yeah, I have an RGB like NVMe SSD that I just bought it for the purpose of adding it to OpenRGB. Like I buy all the crazy RGB stuff, even if it's like, why did they ever RGB that? Because it's
My
like I want to add that to OpenRGB.
my NVMe
But
drive is covered by my GPU. I
yeah, yeah. And then figuring that one out that one was difficult because it
okay.
uses NVMe admin commands to control the
Huh.
RGB. It's weird.
Okay.
That one took a bit of. Luckily, someone else on GitHub figured out like the basic interface of how that worked, and then I was able to figure out the actual protocol. But I kind
Mhm.
of had a starting point because I'm not sure I would have ever figured out how that worked otherwise.
Mhm.
That one was weird.
So, what are the main? Obviously, there's going to be some companies that do some really weird things, but what are the main interaction methods that you have for these devices?
Okay, so there's I squared C.
Hmm.
That one is definitely going to be used for RAM because DDR slots have basically just the memory bus, and then
Hmm.
they have an I squared C bus for the SPD information.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that's the only interface you have to that slot. So you can't really control RGB over the memory bus itself. So
You can
you're
have a
going to
cable
control
that
it
comes
over.
off of the RGB, off
Well,
the
there are
SD.
some that do that. Yes, those I see those as kind of cheating, but
Hmm.
yes, they do exist.
That was a
Um,
joke. I didn't think they actually existed.
no, they do exist. Like where they just plug into your ARGB header on your
Hmm.
motherboard. Um, so yeah, I squared C. USB is the big one.
Hmm.
Whether it's external USB like keyboards, mice, any kind of peripheral, or if it's like onboard USB, like a lot of new motherboards, they have a chip on the board for the RGB, but it's connected over USB.
Oh, okay.
Um, so a lot of the older, like the first RGB boards that came out, were using I squared C
Hmm.
to control the RGB. But that runs into issues because Windows doesn't have a good standard API for accessing I squared C.
How does it
So you
not
have
have
to
a
do a
good
bunch of
API at this
hacks.
point? That makes
It
no
just
sense to me.
doesn't.
Like
Like
after
you just have to talk to the low level registers directly. It's not a good
you
system.
would think that Microsoft would have like worked with one of these companies to do something by this point.
I think the idea there is that like normally the stuff that would be on I squared C or SM bus as it's called on like motherboards, I
Hmm.
squared C and SM bus are very closely related.
Okay.
I think the idea is that those kind of devices would be like temperature sensors and like
Okay.
really low level stuff. And I think a lot of it would be handled by like the BIOS or like
Right. Right.
ACPI. But so they never really intended I squared C or SM bus to be like a user facing
Right.
interface like
Okay.
USB and serial and parallel are. So they never made like a driver standard for
Hmm.
I squared C because they just expected it to be low level enough. It didn't get used that way.
Hmm.
And then, of course, here come RGB manufacturers who are like, we're going to control I squared C from user space by poking chipset registers directly with our own DLLs.
Hmm.
And I remember that also being a security issue. Like there were people talking about, oh, you could use this to access memory that you shouldn't. And so yeah, it's not the way to do it. It's not ideal, but
No.
that's the way that it's done.
Hmm.
So we have to play by their rules, unfortunately. So a lot of newer boards are switching to USB, and that's nice because USB is standardized and a lot better.
Hmm.
And then for GPUs, most of them also use I squared C,
Okay.
but because they go through the GPU vendors' libraries, so NVAPI for NVIDIA and AMD's AMD Display Library or ADL on
Hmm.
AMD, those are I squared C, but they have like actual functions to talk to the I squared C through
Okay.
those vendor libraries. So they're a lot better in that respect. Um, Now we don't necessarily have as good of ways to reverse engineer those because they're going through proper channels, and we can't just poke at registers. But from a actual use perspective, that's better, because poking at registers is not the ideal way to write code. So at least not in user space.
No.
So that's motherboards, RAM, and GPUs. Most everything else is going to be USB. There's, of course, then there are like the Wi-Fi devices, like there are all your lights, your light bulbs, and external stuff. I just added support for DMX, which is DMX is.
If I search DMX, I'm not going to get what I'm looking for.
No, not that DMX. DMX 512. If you search DMX 512, you'll get what you're looking for. It's a protocol used in like stage lighting. To control like lighting fixtures for like production. And DMX is a fairly simple protocol. So there's like an open source DMX to USB adapter. And you can, and while it is used for like the big production expensive stuff, you can buy like cheaper DMX fixtures and use at home. I use them like at Halloween to light up the house or at Christmas and stuff like that. So I added that to OpenRGB.
I've seen some people use this. There's been some like tube lighting that uses this. I thought I recognized it. Okay.
So yeah, there's that, which is kind of a form of serial in a way. It's like an RS-485 communication. Well, the NVMe for the SSDs. And then the ones that I have some devices that are like, I have an external NVMe enclosure that has RGB, and then an external Seagate hard drive that has RGB. And those don't show up as like a normal like USB HID device. HID is like the common USB protocol that is human interface device. So anything that shows up as like a keyboard or a mouse, even if it's not actually a keyboard or a mouse, sometimes it'll just expose a fake keyboard or mouse because that's like a standard interface that you can use. So things that are like drives don't use HID, and so we're not, at least I'm not sure how to talk to them. So those I still need to figure out how to talk to. But yeah, those are probably the common interfaces. Some weird things use like serial, like this is actually supported in OpenRGB because I still have one in one of my old computers. So I added a controller for that, and that uses serial. You can also
one person in the world who has that fan.
And then like there's a bunch of different protocols that you can use with like an Arduino to control an LED strip. For like the DIY option that control over serial. So like those are supported. So yeah. A whole bunch of different interfaces, but I think those are the main ones.
So one thing I do want to get to is, why do you think there is this weird difference between the consumer computer market and the like, smart lighting market? Because clearly the smart lighting guys are like, please make third-party apps. Like that's like their selling point is everything works together. Why do you think there is this weird difference?
Well, I guess the point there is, it seems like not all of the smart lighting companies think the same way.
Sure.
Because like, well, Philips is the weird one because Philips has Hue, and Hue is very well documented. They have a really good developer resource. And then they also have Wiz, which is like their Wi-Fi bulbs, because Hue uses like a Zigbee bridge, and then Wiz just connect directly to Wi-Fi. I think Wiz might now have documentation, but when I started working on them, they did not. And so it seemed like, I think though it might have actually been two different products that were just acquired by the same brand. So, but yeah, some of the smart lighting companies really are open to third-party development. Nanoleaf was another one that I supported more recently. The code was actually submitted by someone on GitLab, and it only worked for like the first generation Nanoleaf. So I ended up buying a Nanoleaf kit to test it on, but I ended up getting the second generation. So I looked up their documentation and wrote the controller for the second generation. And then we ended up with a controller that worked for all of them because of that, because their documentation was just really good. And with the work that he had done and the work I had done combined, we ended up with a pretty good controller that worked for all those different products. And I think they might have a new line out that we don't support, but that wasn't out whenever we wrote the controller.
For anyone who
But
doesn't
I was
recognize the name
impressed.
Nanoleaf, that's the streamer light.
Yeah, those like triangle panels that you put on your walls. Yeah, so they had really good documentation. But I think those companies, because they're not part of a PC, so like I mentioned before, like Razer, Corsair, Logitech, the big names in like PC peripherals, they have an SDK.
Okay.
And I think their SDK is kind of what they intend you to use instead of like talking to the hardware directly. But what they don't realize is that by only supporting Windows and their proprietary software, they're excluding a big chunk of PC gamers or a chunk of PC gamers who don't want to put up with that or use a different operating system. Also, Mac users. I mean, we like to talk about the Linux community. That's where I'm most interested. But I did end up buying a Mac because of OpenRGB to get support on Mac as well, because there were people saying, well, I'd like to be able to control RGB on my Mac, and RGB controls Windows only. And I was like, well, I mean, we're 90% of the way there. All we have to do is get a USB interface and a serial interface and I2C interface that work on Mac. And then that just automatically brings in support for all these devices we've already reverse engineered. So it's like, why not? Why not add another platform? So I think the companies are all laser focused on Windows means gaming.
Right.
And if gamers are just going to download the gamer software and run that, and they'll be happy with that. And the game companies will use our SDK to make gamer lights happen. And so they don't care about people who are using them for other purposes. Whereas the smart light people, I mean, your product is standalone. It doesn't connect to a computer directly. It's its own thing on the network, and so you have to talk to it that way. So I think they're more open to giving you the protocol to talk to it that way. I mean, there is still the issue of the cloud-based stuff in the smart home world that is still quite an issue. I mean, I run Home Assistant for a lot of the smart lights when I'm not using OpenRGB and other smart home stuff. And the local control availability there varies greatly between devices. So, yeah.
You say that gamers are just going to download the gamer software, but my housemate, he plays with some ridiculous DPI because he refused to download Razer Synapse. He's like, whatever it used on the mouse, that's what I'm going to use.
I've seen so many sentiment online that mimic that people, even people who are just Windows users, are like, I don't want to download this bloatware to change my mouse settings, especially when you have to download Razer's bloatware and Corsair's bloatware and Logitech's bloatware if you don't go and buy a Razer everything, because that's the way that they tie you into their ecosystem. And but as the end user, that's not fun. We don't like having to run all of these different software packages, and a lot of them you have to leave open all the time. Like some of them will even like only let your settings stay active while they're open. Like as soon as you close them, you're back to default settings, and it's a mess. So yes, the SDKs for all the developers out there of these software programs, the SDKs are not enough. They're not enough. Not even enough for the Windows users, it seems. So,
well, one thing you did point out in the video you did, was it OpenPled? No, it was the OpenPled video. We said with the AMD, what was the AMD cooler? The
Wraith Prism.
Where it didn't support certain things in the software. So even if they did have, like, even if they do have whatever software they have, it may not actually support everything the hardware physically supports.
Right. I've run into that quite a few times, but the AMD Prism was kind of a notable recent example. As I thought we had this thing all figured out for 2 years, because this was one of the early devices I added whenever I had first renamed the project from OpenRA SDK to OpenRGB and started trying to support more devices. This was one that I knew was popular at the time. It was low cost, and I was into AMD stuff, so I bought one. Reverse engineered it as best I could with the software they gave me. and I thought we had it completely figured out. And then 3 years later, Intel releases the RK770 that uses a similar design RGB controller from
Because
Cooler
they'll
Master.
both, yeah.
They're both from Cooler Master. And we discover that it has a direct mode control protocol that lets you access every LED. And just for fun, I was like, does the Prism support that? And sure enough, it does. But that ability had gone hidden for years. And I know there were at least one other project trying to reverse engineer the AMD Prism.
Mm-hmm.
And that project also did not have support for per LED control of individual colors. I think they had it figured out where you could set like 2 different banks of colors, like color A and color B, and then assign either color A or B to each LED in the ring. So you could do like a progress bar kind of thing,
Okay.
but you couldn't do like a rainbow where you could set each one to a different color.
Mm-hmm.
So it turns out that functionality was there all along. And because the only documentation we had was the official software, if the official software doesn't use it, then we can't know about it. So yeah, that's just a problem with reverse engineering.
How did you find out they were both by Cooler Master?
I know the AMD software actually was branded Cooler Master.
Okay.
Like, it had like by Cooler Master in it somewhere.
Right.
I think the USB vendor IDs were also Cooler Master's vendor ID. So,
okay.
and then when I saw the Intel software, it just had that same look to it as the AMD software.
Right. So. Okay. So when you're trying to, we'll go with the USB devices first. When you're trying to reverse engineer one of these protocols, like what is the process you actually go through?
Well, so the first step would be, well, I guess the video I just recently did, a series of videos on the ROG Ally, because that one I didn't really know for sure what it was going to be. Like, okay, if it's a mouse, you know, the only interface it has to the PC is USB.
Right.
It's pretty obvious it's going to be USB and likely going to be HID as well because it's a mouse.
Are things different if it's a Bluetooth mouse?
Yes.
Okay.
Bluetooth supports HID, but we don't support very many Bluetooth devices. In fact, I think the only Bluetooth device we do support is like the PS4 controller, which has RGB.
Oh, it does, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. That like usually it just uses to show what player it is, but that's just an RGB LED. But for the most part, we don't support Bluetooth devices. There's nothing saying we can't. It's just that reverse engineering them isn't as easy. And then a lot of Bluetooth devices don't actually expose their full control set over Bluetooth. Like I know I have some Bluetooth, like dual mode keyboards that can work Bluetooth or wired. And they expose their full control set over wired, but they're only a basic keyboard over Bluetooth.
Okay.
So I know there are some devices like that where the Bluetooth capabilities are limited to just the primary functionality. But yeah, there's nothing saying you couldn't because HID works over Bluetooth as well. So,
I derailed you there. You were talking about the reverse engineering process.
Yeah. So the idea would be first to figure out what interface it is. So we went over the different interfaces. So that's probably going to be obvious by what type of device it is. But whenever you're dealing with like something that's RGB built into a system, whether it's a motherboard, a laptop, handheld, then it could be I2C, it could be USB, it could be. I know there's some weird Asus laptops that use like WMI for it, and I think WMI is like a low-level BIOS thing, and I'm not sure if it's actually a hardware interface or not. But that's how we figured out how to talk to it is by calling it ACPI or a WMI function.
Windows also has a thing called WMI. I cannot find the one you're looking for.
It is that. It's like
Windows
management. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So there's like WMI methods that you call to control the RGB on some laptop. And then some older MSI boards use like the Super IO directly for RGB because they only do like single RGB, like just analog 12-volt RGB.
Mm-hmm.
And they just have like 3 PWM channels in the Super I/O that you just talk to directly and output 3 voltages onto 3 pins. So you figure it out by kind of, well, first of all, you look at the USB device list and see if there's any USB device on the system that could be an RGB controller.
Mm-hmm.
If there are no USB devices that could be an RGB controller, then you kind of have to dig into. There's like different tools that you can use. I think there's like a process monitor or process explorer, something like that,
Mm-hmm.
that shows like all the different calls to DLL files in Windows, and you can breakpoint on them. And so if you find like it's writing to some hardware register or calling some DLL that accesses hardware,
Mm-hmm.
you can breakpoint on that and try and figure out what's being passed in. I think that's how that person figured out NVMe for the SSD.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's how we originally figured out like NVIDIA graphics cards was calling into NVAPI. But you would always want to start with USB, I think, because USB is going to be probably the most likely and the easiest to reverse engineer because Wireshark can capture that.
Okay.
So that's what I did on the Ally. Was it looked like the controller, the RGB was part of like the built-in game controller that it had,
Right.
and that was like a USB peripheral connected to the motherboard internally. And so I figured out pretty quickly that it had an Asus vendor ID USB device, and then that was the cue to try and capture data from that and see what it was doing.
So, and then it's a sort of matter of decoding what that data is.
Yeah, so basically you just start looking at streams of bytes and you don't know what any of them mean. So what I always try to do is I try and set like a known value, like red is going to be FF0000.
Right.
In hex, and then you go and you look through the bytes and you try and look for zeros and FFs and see if you find them. And then if you do find a packet, usually like the first few bytes are going to be some kind of ID that tells it like which packet is, what the command is. So then I go and I change it to green or something, and now it shifts from FF0000 to FF00. And then I go and I look for the same packet and see, okay, did the FF move to this other position? And then once I find where that transition is, then I write down, okay, this is the structure of that packet, and then try to figure out which byte is red, which byte is green, which byte is blue, and then like any potential modes and parameters that you can adjust in the software. Just tweak those parameters, go look at the data, see what changed. So it's basically just make a change, look for a change, and then try and figure out how to connect the two. So yeah.
If you're dealing with an I2C device, how does that process change?
That changes a lot. So Wireshark doesn't capture I2C. So because of the way Windows accesses I2C by just poking at low-level control registers, we can take advantage of that. And basically, we wrote a tool called I wrote a tool called I2C Sniffer, and what it does is it just continuously reads the I2C register over and over again, and then you run the other program that tries to write to it, and hopefully you read it fast enough that you can catch the value that was put in and read it out before the hardware changes it to a new value. And you just probe it so fast that you can basically just decode what was being put in to that register, and then basically capture that data and then log it to a file of like which bytes were written and like word lengths and all that.
That sounds like a hack.
It is a huge hack, but it actually most of the time works. And because every application writes to the registers in its own way, at its own timing, at its own everything, it doesn't work consistently or for everything. It works differently on AMD versus Intel because the registers are different.
Right.
And then some programs it doesn't seem to capture, and some programs it does. So it's not reliable, but it's reliable enough that we've gotten some good use out of it. And if you can't with that, then you either a lot of I2C devices are sort of treated like just a block of memory.
Okay.
So they have their own like internal registers. So if you set FF0000 for like red, for instance,
Mhm.
then you can go do a command on Linux. There's a command called I2C dump, and that will read those registers out from a device. And so
Right.
you can like set, read, and then look for changes that way.
Mm-hmm.
But some devices use more like a packet structure I2C command, where it's not just writing to memory, it's sending a packet, and that packet's not stored anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And those are harder to diagnose or debug because you can't just read the memory back and see the packets being written.
Mm-hmm.
And if that doesn't work, then you have to go the hardware route. That's when you break out the oscilloscope or the logic analyzer, find the I2C pin on your motherboard and try and poke it or solder a wire to it or something like that to debug it. I have soldered wires to motherboards before
Uh-huh.
for that kind of purpose. So
I'm sure that's always want to avoid that as much as possible.
yes, that's the nuclear option. You don't want to do that, but sometimes they leave you no choice.
Mm-hmm.
I never actually did it, but I was planning on, because the I2C is a bus, so all the RAM slots are all kind of wired to the same I2C interface.
Mm-hmm.
I was planning on taking one stick of RAM and soldering like the lines to that stick of RAM, and then you could just plug that RAM module in, and you'd have a probing interface there without having to hook up to the board. But
Uh-huh.
sometimes the RAM and then the onboard I2C are on two different interfaces, so that wouldn't always work, but
Mm-hmm.
it could help you in some circumstances. So
Whenever I
yeah.
talk to people about reverse engineering, it always starts at like something, something kind of nice and just evolves into, yeah, just make it
Yeah.
work somehow.
Yeah, it can be quite a process to reverse engineer, and that's just kind of the idea was, I want to it's just a puzzle. You just look at it and you go, okay, here's the thing. Obviously it somehow communication gets from point A to point B. Okay, now what is that communication? How does it work? And what are the tools that I have at my disposal to figure that out?
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes it's a puzzle. That's how it was, at least in the beginning, when we had no idea how it worked. It was like, okay, well, we're talking to RAM. What interfaces could it possibly use?
Mm-hmm.
So you look at the pinout of the RAM slot and you go, okay, it's got a memory bus and it's got I2C and it's got some power. So it has to be one of those two. It's probably the I2C. I mean, my first test setup was I literally took the back panel off of my computer, and there was a hole cut in the case behind the RAM slots.
Uh-huh.
And then I put helping, like those helping hands used for soldering. I
Uh-huh.
clipped an oscilloscope probe into one of those. I put it on top of a box, and then I just nudged it forward until it was poking the right pin on the back of the board,
Uh-huh.
and then hooked it up to the scope and looked at it while I was changing the RGB commands.
Mm-hmm.
It worked. It got me the data, and somehow I didn't short out my RAM slot doing it. So
Ha- have you ever done? Have you ever killed any hardware trying to mess around like this?
actually, no,
Wow,
surprisingly not. No.
I'm
I've bricked
impressed.
some things, but I haven't like permanently damaged hardware. So,
Well, look, if
and
you
the
had
things that I've
documentation,
bricked, I
you
was
wouldn't
able
have
to
to do
read.
this.
Right. Yes, that's the ultimate goal. Is reverse engineering can be interesting,
Mhm.
but it shouldn't be necessary.
Well, clearly you enjoy this like as a challenge now, but you said you
Mm-hmm.
started with that fan project back in like university, college, whatever you were doing at the time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Had you always been interested in doing some sort of project like that, or was it just like I want to make an RGB fan?
So I've always been interested in programming and computers,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe not necessarily RGB. My username CalcProgrammer1 comes from I I was I basically learned to program in freshman year of high school by
Mm-hmm.
looking at code on my calculator during class, my TI-84. Um, so yeah, that's where the name comes from.
Mm-hmm.
But then I went into like learn C++, took some courses, and then went into college for computer engineering. And that got me into like microcontrollers. I was on the robotics team, and they were using microcontrollers to
Mm-hmm.
drive motors and such. Um, so I had ordered some parts to just play around with microcontrollers, and I ordered like a servo. I ordered like some RGB LEDs. I ordered some like serial port stuff, an Arduino, some microcontrollers, just some like bits and pieces to play around with and learn. And so basically, one of the starter projects for microcontroller programming is, can you blink an LED, and then can you use PWM to control the brightness of an LED, and that goes into RGB. And then at the same time I was doing that, I was upgrading my computer. Actually, it was kind of my home server, and it was the one that I had shown earlier on this instructable page. This was my computer at the time, and I like the idea of the light up fans, but at the time RGB wasn't a thing, so I bought a blue LED fan to put in my computer. And when I got it, one of the 4 LEDs was burnt out, and I was upset because the LED was burnt out. So I complained to Newegg. They were going to send me a new one. But then I had the idea, I like RGB lights. I've got this fan that has burnout LEDs and doesn't look good, but I don't know, something went, you could take those LEDs out and put RGB LEDs in, and then you could use the microcontroller to drive the 4 LEDs, and then you wouldn't just have a fan, you'd have a cool color changing fan that wasn't a thing at the time. So
I'm just noticing the DVD drive you have above it as well. Like, that just shows the age of that picture.
Yeah, this computer was kind of old. Yeah, I took the parts out of an old white box case to put in this case. Yeah. So yeah, then I built the fan by putting in the 4 LEDs and just wiring like analog cables to each one, held down with tape. And then I made this big board that has like 12 different PWM channels, and then it actually also drives the fan speed on the same board. So that was kind of where I got into RGB. And then since I had built that, I was like, I don't know, somewhere I found some code to like do a music visualizer. And I was like, I could make the fan blink to music with that. And I did. And then when I built my next computer, I built 3 more of these to put 3 of them in my computer and link them all together and have more RGB. And then it just kind of went from there. So it went from that to RGB Christmas lights, and then to what we have now, which is RGB everything. So
right now we're very I'm not seeing much of the B and G right now.
Yeah, I turned off the effect. We can just turn that back on. So
I've never really been one for like the RGB devices sort of thing. I have red fans in my computer. My keyboard, it's just a rainbow pattern by default. My mouse is red. Like it's not the thing that I'm super interested in. If anyone's seen my like my desktop, they know I don't really care about consistent theming. But I can totally understand like why, if you buy these devices, you want to have like, I get the appeal of, all this lighting being synced up together, all this lighting, doing the same sort of pattern or whatever it is you're trying to go for.
Yeah. I think part of the reason that RGB interested me was like, yeah, it's cool that it lights up, but as a programmer, I was always like, it's cooler if I can control it.
Right.
And not only can you like control it, but you could actually do useful things with it. Like, we have an OpenRGB hardware plugin where it reads like the temperature of your CPU or something, and you can change it from green to red or something like that. Like, you could link up the lights to do more than just be pretty lights. You could actually have them integrate, whether it's a music visualizer or syncing up with the image on your screen, or even like notifying you of an email or a message or something like that. The possibilities are pretty unlimited. So that was kind of why I thought it was cool, was just, not it's cool looking, but then you could do a lot of stuff with it. So.
I hadn't even thought of doing anything productive with it. Huh. That's like... Yeah, no, I guess you could just control your... you could have it set up with your nose, couldn't you? Huh.
Yeah, you could do all kinds of stuff with it. Like, any kind of state that you would want to possibly display not on your screen, you could theoretically use RGB for, whether it's using an LED strip to indicate like a level, or like CPU usage, RAM, temperature, anything like that, or I mean, the game integrations are a thing that OpenRGB hasn't focused on, but
Mm-hmm.
there are other community projects out there. There's Aurora RGB, and then there's another one called Artemis RGB, both
Mm-hmm.
open source projects. And those projects more focused on like making RGB effects for games. So like
Okay.
I know Aurora had one that unfortunately Aurora is Windows only, but Artemis
Mm-hmm.
is now available on Linux.
That's cool.
But Aurora had one for CSGO, and it would display like using the F key row at the top of your keyboard would be like your health.
Huh.
And then like whenever you plant the bomb, the number pad would start flashing in time with the counter, and like it would turn red if you were getting low on health and flash or stuff like
Mm-hmm.
that. So there were different game integrations. That was an unofficial one
Mm-hmm.
that I thought was maybe more practical than just a pretty effect, because like Overwatch has an official one where it just lights up the keyboard the color of whatever character you're playing, but
Okay.
it doesn't do anything too like actually useful.
Right. Right. Right.
But like displaying your health bar or something like that could be potentially useful if you're looking down at your keyboard, which you're probably not. But
Yeah. No.
um,
You're
yeah.
probably not.
So
Let's see. Which two? Trying to find it'll be somewhere. Is it Signal RGB?
yeah, so Signal RGB kind of came out of nowhere to me. I know I had heard of the creator before on like the Aurora Discord and on
Mm-hmm.
Reddit and stuff, but like they seems like what they're trying to do is pretty much the same idea as what OpenRGB is trying to do,
Mm.
but proprietary and with a
Oh,
software as a service model.
I see.
So yeah,
As seen on
it's free to
LTT, yeah.
use, but you have to pay if you want the fancy game effects and stuff. So
I see,
it's
I
like
see.
I get what they're trying to do, but I'm all about going the open source route.
Mm-hmm.
So
Well, actually, that's a good point. How did you get yourself interested in this route? Because OpenRGB is licensed under is it GPL v2 or
two,
later?
yeah,
Yeah.
I think yeah, GPL, yeah,
Mhm.
GPL 2.
Why?
So
How did you get involved
yeah,
in this space then?
I've always, I mean, in high school, I got into Linux, and then I found out about open source. And I've always been interested in open source and, that whole side of things, being a Linux user. And
Mm-hmm.
just, I like the idea of the GPL where you make your code open and then it stays open because any fork has to be like licensed under the same equivalent license.
Mm-hmm.
So and I knew that's what the Linux kernel used. And so I was like, if it's good enough for the Linux kernel. So
I guess that's a simple enough way
that's
to get to it.
that's the route I went for OpenRGB. So
Well, how did you get yourself involved in Linux then? Like, how did that catch your attention?
in high school, my friend had mentioned Linux, and at the time, my parents still had dial-up. So he was like, "Oh, Linux is really cool."
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, "Okay, fine, I'll give it a try because it's cool. It's free operating system. I didn't know what
Mm-hmm.
to expect. I was just kind of getting into computers at the time."
Mm-hmm.
So I downloaded the smallest, lightest possible Linux distro I could find at the time. And I think it was like 100 megabytes. And it
Oh
took a
God.
whole week to download over every night. I'd turn it on, download overnight, pause it in the morning, resume. A week later, I had my Linux CD.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the most bare bones thing I've ever used. I think it had like Fluxbox as the window manager, and it had just a tiny handful of programs. And I was like, this is what Linux has to offer. I was very unimpressed.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of wrote the whole thing off as, this isn't good. Like I liked Windows XP.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
so like 2 years, maybe a year or two later, we had
Mm-hmm.
upgraded to high speed internet. And actually,
What
I
does
had
high speed mean in this context? Not
cable at that point,
not dial up. Yeah. Okay.
not dial up. Yeah, anything that wasn't dial up was high speed.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
So, and that you could use without tying up the phone line during
Yeah.
normal
Yeah.
hours of the day. But I had a Windows Mobile PDA, a
Mm-hmm.
Dell PDA, and I was looking because the Windows Mobile operating system was pretty terrible. I was looking for an alternate operating system, and I thought, well, Linux on this would be okay. I ran across Ubuntu at the time, and I was like, well, this looks a lot different than the Linux I had used before.
Mm-hmm.
So I decided, well, it wasn't my original goal of running on my PDA, but I was like, I'll try this out.
Wait, I didn't know
And
this
it
device
was a
existed.
night and day difference than the other Linux I had tried, and I really liked it. And so I was like, all of this for free. And at the time, Ubuntu was really big on the Linux for human beings, and we're a
Yep.
community and we're open, and they were all pushing about being open and all that. So I kind of got into it from that, and then Ubuntu started going their own ways, and I moved to Debian, but and now Arch. But yeah, so that was kind of where I got into Linux, and ever since I've dual booted, and then more recently I've pretty much stopped using Windows at home entirely, except for reverse engineering. So
I'm just looking at this some of these Windows PDAs, and this is a cursed looking device. What? Like it's can I send a link? How do I send a link on Jitsi? Let's see. Here we go. This is the one I was looking at. It's just this ugly green interface.
Not quite I had the Dell Axim X50V, I think.
Okay.
And but it was that same user interface. It wasn't that ugly of a design, but it was that same interface, which wasn't the most usable.
I didn't even realize that Microsoft had mobile. I see. I'm one of these people that have amnesia with Windows devices. I thought their first mobile devices were the Windows 8
the
smartphones.
Windows Phone.
Yeah, the Windows phones.
Yeah, no, they had the Windows Mobile before that, and that was what I was into at the time. I mean, that was pre-iPhone, so it wasn't actually a phone; it was just a PDA. But that also kind of got me into the mobile computing scene in general. Got me interested in smartphones and stuff, and Linux on smartphones, and now my daily driver is this.
What in the world is that thing?
PinePhone Pro with keyboard case.
Oh, that's cool.
So
how's that going?
I've been liking it a lot. It's still rough around the edges as a phone,
right?
But as a pocket laptop with a keyboard that you can write code and do all kinds of stuff on, it's pretty cool. So that got me into the Linux smartphone world as well. So
it seems like that world is coming along. It's coming along. I wouldn't say
it definitely
coming along well.
is. I've been playing around with Linux on smartphones. Well, probably I messed around with it in college too. With the HP touchpad, was a pretty popular tablet back then. Tried to run different Linux on that. Throughout the years, I've tried like the Linux on Android projects, like the CH roots and stuff. And it's been kind of, yes, it's Linux, but it's not like full blown Linux. And there's always been some like holdback, some hindrance. But now, like actually running Linux and mainline Linux at that on smartphones is at least more possible than it used to be. So yeah, I enjoy playing around with that stuff. So
I've had people ask me like, "Hey, you want to try out this project? You want to try out that project?" Like, if I get involved in the mobile space, like there's so much there that I've not touched. Like that's a whole, like I can just focus on the desktop, and that already gives me enough to talk about. If I get involved in that as well, it'll be fun for sure. But there's just so much there.
Yeah, with like there's so many different phones that can run Linux, whether it's like officially like the Pine phones or unofficially with Postmarket OS and such. I was playing with Postmarket OS on the OnePlus 6T, which is one of their better supported phones these days. There's a lot there for sure. Lots of new interface concepts, like how to use Linux and desktop apps at that on a mobile screen. Definitely there's a lot going on there.
When we're on the top, I was going to bring this up just before we were on the topic of Windows. Have you been paying any attention to Windows 11 getting native RGB controls?
On and off. Okay. And at first I was very like this isn't great, and Windows is going to find some way to make it proprietary. Or, well, I
Mhm.
was thinking that aspect, and then I was also thinking, how is Windows going to wrangle all these device manufacturers? Are they just going to do what we did and reverse engineer all these
That would be
devices?
hilarious.
Are they going to require the vendors to make Windows drivers for some new Windows API?
Mhm.
Which then I'm like, well, it's not going to support old stuff at that point because the vendors aren't going to go back and write support for their old devices.
Right.
And is Microsoft even going to go back and write support for their old devices? And so I was kind of hesitant on what that would actually look like.
Mhm.
And I was like, well, OpenRGB, we want to support everything, including the old devices. But with it being a Windows thing, it's like, will the old stuff be supported and how will it be supported?
Mhm.
It looks like going forward, it's not going to be supported, which is kind of what I expected. But
Right.
I do at least agree with how they're going about it. They're
Okay.
not creating some new Windows API from what it sounds like. Instead, what it sounds like is Windows is going to require the device manufacturers to implement the HID lamp array standard, which is like an actual published USB specification standard for controlling LEDs,
Mhm.
which I don't think anyone uses at this point. Everyone creates their own standard. So Windows is going to kind of say, well, our standard RGB interface in Windows 11 is going to work as long as your device implements this protocol.
Mhm.
And if everyone wants to use that, they have to implement that protocol on their device. And then OpenRGB can also use that protocol
I was gonna say because
because it's a standard.
that would make it simpler for you guys as well. Then.
It would. And what I really like is that the Microsoft Windows team behind that actually published a reference implementation using an Arduino. So
Okay.
they actually published an Arduino code that you can load onto an Arduino that will now communicate over USB and act as this reference standard for the HID lamp array lighting protocol
Mhm.
that will work with Windows 11 that other vendors can use as an example for getting it working on their own devices.
Mhm.
So I actually ordered the parts to build one of those, but I haven't got those yet because I want to get that supported in OpenRGB as well.
Mhm.
So um,
So it definitely does sound like an exciting change then, because
yeah, I think that's a good change.
if anyone's gonna be able to get companies to like actually do some
Agree.
it's native support in Windows.
Yeah, that is true. And I think Windows chose possibly the best way they could have to make that happen
Yeah.
is push it onto the manufacturers and make them adopt a real standard.
Mhm.
I think that's the best way they could have, rather than writing like they could have said, okay, Windows now has this driver API
Yeah,
and
we call it
you
direct
have
lighting.
to write direct lighting or yeah. And then every vendor would have to write their own driver. And now you're just running more vendor software. It's
Mhm.
just behind the scenes rather than in your face.
Mhm. Mhm.
But no, I think using the USB protocol, that's the way to do it.
Mhm.
So
I hope this goes well then. Like I do hope that
yeah,
that like I think what you really need, you need a couple of companies to decide that they're going to start supporting it. And then as they do, then it becomes like, part of their marketing material. Like, we're supported natively in
right.
Windows. And then other companies, they're not. So, like, then they sort of have to start getting involved with it. And it, like with OpenPlay, you don't
Yeah.
need every company at the start to jump on board with it. But if you have,
Mm-hmm.
you have like a Logitech, a Razer, someone like that, they jump on board and they make it like a big deal. They're jumping on board, then that acts as sort of like a selling point, and other companies might, if people actually start changing the devices they buy, might actually start changing what they do.
I agree. Yes. I think it's a good thing that both of these initiatives are happening at kind of at the same time as well,
Mm-hmm.
with the Windows pushing their HID standard on the vendors and then OpenPleb also coming out, backed by two fairly large, well-known YouTubers
Mm-hmm.
and like players in this industry
Mm-hmm.
um, that actually feel like they can actually get stuff done because of their reputation, their size. Having both of these coming out at the same time, I think is even going to have a bigger effect, just because hopefully OpenPleb gets them to publish their standards behind their existing stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But then maybe the Windows 11 thing would try to also push them all to unify towards a more standard interface to begin with,
Mm-hmm.
which then they would also publish documentation, but it's already an open standard at that point. So I think that would fulfill both sides. So
like, pushing towards the standard does take a long time. Like, I'm sure you remember back when every phone manufacturer had their own connector for a charger, or sometimes there'd be a company that had 12 different connectors for their own phones, and now it's just with besides Apple, who still wants to keep trying to do their own thing. I know they had to change for Europe, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah.
There was, I think it was an EU regulation.
Like, this has taken a long time to get here. A really long time.
I'm glad that there is some standardization there. I mean, the world did sort of, the non-Apple world kind of standard around micro, and now that they're all standard around Type-C, which is, I like that Type-C is kind of just becoming the standard for everything, because you can charge laptops with it. You can power your soldering iron with it. You can charge your phone with it and your Steam Deck and your everything else. And yeah, it's just a nice standard.
I think when we're still in this transitionary period between micro and C, it's a bit annoying, because I have USB, I have micro device on my desk, I have C device on my desk. It's really annoying right now, but give it another like 5 or so years as hopefully everything standardizes on it. I say that, but I have a USB Mini B powered device on my desk as well. So like, you know, you're still gonna have these weird devices that want to do their own stupid things, but for the most part, we're going to get to a point where you legitimately can do everything on a single, maybe not a single cable. I don't see USB-A going anywhere, but at least 2 cables. That is all.
For sure. It's gotten a lot better recently, like with everything moving to Type-C. I still have a lot of micro USB stuff, but I also, whenever the change started, I bought a whole bunch of USB micro to C and C to micro adapters so that I could just adapt everything. So yeah. So
one thing I did want to ask you about, so you said that there is a, well, I think on the OpenRGB website, that's OpenRGB, where is it? There's a lot of device classes, a lot of devices now supported. Is there any device classes that you'd want to get involved in that you haven't been able to do yet, or maybe you've not been able to work out yet, or anything like that?
I mean, I think as far as RGB is concerned, we've got most of the bases covered. I mean, we've got everything from your keyboard and mouse to like now with DMX, your stage lighting. So I think we've covered quite the range of RGB, and I don't know of anything that any like overall category that we're really missing out on. I mean, we have devices, manufacturers that we're missing out on, but I think maybe the next type of device that might be like RGB adjacent, as you might call it, would be like the LCD screens.
Right.
Like with coolers and graphics cards and cases now starting to have their own LCD screens. I don't know that we could just represent an LCD screen as just a big RGB matrix and get away with it. I mean, we could, but I don't know that that's the best way to do it. But like, it might be possible to come up with some additional like API within OpenRGB to handle LCD screens. And then the other one that would be interesting and that we've had a few attempts at is actually fan control. Okay. So I know fan control and RGB control kind of get linked together in a lot of places because a lot of RGB devices have fans, whether it's graphics cards, cases, CPU coolers, all this stuff, or like water cooling pumps. So I had an early branch called fan controller where I tried to make like a standard fan controller API, kind of like what I did for RGB controller, and standardized like the Corsair, what was it, Commander Pro, their like RGB and fan hub box that connects with USB, and then like some from NZXT that have fan and RGB combined into one box.
Mm-hmm.
I think one from Thermaltake. And so it basically added an extra tab on the OpenRGB UI that just had sliders for fan control. I never got too in depth with it, like adding fan curves and different modes and stuff like that. But I kind of wanted to go that direction, but I never actually went that direction. And then I was kind of against adding like the ability to do synchronized effects to OpenRGB in the beginning.
Okay.
Well, not just entirely against it, but in the OpenRGB itself.
Right.
And the reason was I wanted OpenRGB to stay really lightweight and small and simple and just focus down on the core of let's control hardware and as much hardware as we can with as little a memory and CPU footprint as possible. And then I made an SDK for OpenRGB that was like a network server client-based architecture where other programs could then control the devices remotely. But there were interests from other people in the Discord about having an effects tab in OpenRGB that had like built-in software effects that you could synchronize everything with without having to run a separate program. So what we ended up doing was we kind of compromised and added a plugin architecture where the effects plugin could be a separate project that is just a DLL plugin that you can install into OpenRGB and it adds that tab. Well, one of the other plugins from a community developer was the fan control plugin, and that one's pretty cool because that one uses it's called Libre Hardware Monitor. It's a program in Windows and like a library for accessing like the motherboard fans and such. And I know there's a program called Fan Control that gets talked about a lot. And I think that program also uses Libre Hardware Monitor. But the Fan Control plugin for OpenRGB used that Libre Hardware Monitor, and it had like the ability of fan curves and stuff. And it was just an extra tab within OpenRGB. So it would be cool, like maybe not to add things directly, but as plugins that you could expand it out to add capability for other hardware control type features. Kind of unify it as like the central control hub for your PC in some ways.
On the flip side of that question, is there anything you feel like is sort of outside the scope of OpenRGB that maybe someone could argue should be in there, but you just don't think should be included?
Well, so
because you've expanded to Philips Hue, so you're already outside of the PC.
So I think as far as like RGB control goes, I'm okay with does it take an RGB value and control some sort of light?
Right.
If that's the case, then I think it's fine to include and it should be included. But is it doing something other than that? And one thing that's been thrown around is like lights that only do white or like lights that only do single color. And I think the are kind of like, should we or shouldn't we?
So it'd be like controlling the dimming on that, I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think we do have some that are like that supported by OpenRGB. And basically the idea is we're not going to change the color model or anything to represent it as a dimming. We're just going to represent it as an RGB value and then like convert that into a brightness and apply it to the light. So like take the average or the maximum or whatever of RGB and just produce the brightness, and that way you can at least synchronize it up with your other lights. So so that was one where I was kind of, should we do this or not? But I think as far as like other features go, I think there's a lot that I would say shouldn't be in OpenRGB because it's not just let's control a light with the software, but I would be happy with it being a plugin or an external program that links up with OpenRGB.
Right. Because when you get into the state of plugins, then they're,
they're
go
just
do whatever you want.
on functionality. Yep. So
Okay.
Yeah, that way we can keep the base program lightweight, which
Yeah,
is
you don't want
kind
to
of the
become,
goal.
a Razor Synapse or
Right.
whatever.
That's been the whole idea. So, like, every time someone wants to add a big feature that's going to add crazy amounts of memory and usage and whatnot, it's like
Right.
this should be a plugin, because OpenRGB's goal is to stay away from becoming what it's trying to replace.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so,
I'm sort of genuinely impressed by the range of devices that are supported, and I didn't even know that some of these device classes had lighting, like normal ones like motherboards, RAM, all that makes sense. But then there's
mhm.
I always forget that mouse mats exist with color, and then you told me about
Yeah.
storage. Then there's headset stands. What is
hmm
virtual devices? Okay, there's nothing in that list. Okay.
Virtual device, I think, were just a plugin thing for
Okay.
plugins to be able to register their own devices that are just handled in software.
I see. I see. I
So,
see. But like, there's so much supported in here. I Obviously there's still a lot of things that you would like to do, without a doubt.
mhm.
But
Yeah,
like, as it stands, like so much work has already been done.
yeah. There's been a ton of work, and I did a lot of the early work on OpenRGB, but then it really exploded as a community project, and I
Mhm.
got lots of contributions, and people have been really good about just committing, and we've had a lot of people kind of seems like they've picked up the duty of maintaining one particular brand or one
Mhm.
particular controller class of devices. So, I mean, the community around OpenRGB has been great.
Mhm. Mhm.
And we've had a lot of good people contributing. So yeah, just really thankful for the community behind OpenRGB and what they've allowed it to grow into. So
Well,
that
On
device list is pretty crazy now. So
on that note, before we end it off, I do want to ask if someone wants to get involved with OpenRGB, like what's like how would they go about doing so? Like what if someone who has not approached the project before, what is a good way for
mhm.
them to get started?
Well, I think probably the biggest help for OpenRGB would be adding new devices. I think that's just kind of, yes, there are feature improvements that could be done, and you could, if you want to add effects, you could help out with the other plugins, which the developers of the plugins also kind of live in our Discord. But
Mhm.
if you want to help out with OpenRGB itself, probably the biggest help is new device support.
Mhm.
Um, because we're always looking to expand the list of devices, and everyone always has something new that we don't support.
Mhm.
But unfortunately, that's also going to be the hardest one, because you have to learn reverse engineering
Yep.
and techniques like that. But I hope that we can provide that information, and kind of our community in general can just teach people what they need to get into reverse engineering. I know I've heard from people who say, they got into reverse engineering or programming because of OpenRGB, and that's always nice to hear. So, um, yeah. But if there's still other things, there's always, I mean, anything that you see in the code that
Mhm.
you think you can improve, like merge requests are always welcome. Unfortunately, we always said, issues are welcome, and they still are. But unfortunately, the issue tracker has just grown and grown and grown more than we can
Yep.
manage at this point. Like, the issue tracker was the way to go early on in the project, but
1.3K open.
yeah, it's just growing so hard that we don't have the time to manage it anymore almost.
Mhm.
So it seems like I spend all my time on just merge requests or adding features myself. So,
Mhm.
or just Discord for the immediate questions. But even then, we can't answer every question all the time, unfortunately. So,
Right.
so we've tried to put up documentation. I think there is a lot we could do with the website to improve it. I've been
Mhm.
trying to make it better over time. And then the wiki, which we used to be pretty big on the wiki. I haven't been updating it as much, kind of pushing it off to its own repo
Mhm.
so that other people can collaborate on it. Um, so the wiki that's actually on the GitLab page itself is kind of outdated.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, there's probably the best thing if you're really interested in OpenRGB and you want to get into reverse engineering would be to try and get into reverse engineering. I mean, I just published 2 videos about doing the ROG ally for that you could use as guidance, or if you have questions about reverse engineering, I think people in Discord would be happy to answer that. I'm in there a lot, just to learn the process, and hopefully sooner rather than later that won't be as necessary if documentation starts being available. But until then, learn how to use Wireshark, unfortunately. So. But
yeah, it's good that you mentioned those 2 videos. I was about to say those as well. Check those out, because I think, like, you go through a lot of the process you go throughout, like, doing something like that. Like, you're not entirely sure how you would approach it from the start. You work it out, and then you eventually get it, work. At least, I didn't watch the second part, but at least with that first part, you got the sticks, like, changing color.
Yeah. The second part I just uploaded this morning. So, yeah, it's just basically that was just finishing it off and figuring out all the different effect modes. I think we were close, but there were some little minor things we ran into. Like there's a command you have to send to apply the changes, and then after you've actually set the packet. But then I got it working, and so definitely check those out if you're interested in learning reverse engineering. I think that it's going to be it's kind of a slow and boring watch maybe, but I think it does go through the entire process. And reverse engineering, unfortunately, unless you're really into puzzles and like figuring things out, it is kind of a chore. So that's the unfortunate part about it. But unfortunately, that's also the thing that we need the most of for OpenRGB, because and I mean, it's not just OpenRGB, because you talk about Linux in general, and so much in the Linux world is reverse engineered. I'm just thinking about all the crazy projects going on with GPU drivers these days, with like the Apple M1 driver and Panfrost, and so many projects, and the new NVK NVIDIA stuff. It's just reverse engineering is so crucial to Linux right now. And
absolutely.
Hopefully it's not always that way, but yeah.
Maybe one day it won't be,
Yeah.
but for now at least, I'm really happy that people like you are out there doing this kind of work and trying to get this support out there. And hey, I guess if you weren't doing this work, there probably wouldn't have been an open pleb in the first place. If people weren't doing this reverse engineering work, there wouldn't have been this indication that there was so much interest in making this happen.
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised whenever OpenPleb came out. I watched the video, and then I looked down and they had like called out OpenRGB as like their example of like, this is the kind of project that would benefit. And it's like, well, yeah, we would. So that's why I was like, I need to react to that. I need to, get in contact, because that was something I'd been hoping people would do all along. But it was like when I started the project, it was like, I'm just some guy with some RGB. And if I tell Corsair to give me documentation, what are they going to say? But if I reverse engineer it, I might make progress. So, I'm glad that it's getting more attention for sure.
Absolutely. I think that's as good of a place as any to end off the show. So,
yeah,
let people know where they can find your work, how they can get involved in OpenRGB, all that stuff.
The main thing is both our website, https://openrgb.org, and then the GitLab, which is linked in, well, I have it pulled up behind me. So openrgb.org.
Oh, there you go.
There's this menu on the side. Oh, I'm clicking on the preview, not the other screen. I have it mirrored to my other screen. And we have GitLab as the first link up here. If you go to that takes you to our GitLab page. This is where you can browse the code. You should go through our README. We have some information on like how-tos, how to contribute. So like the information about the API, the SDK, and like contributing guidelines.
Awesome.
I think that would be a good starting place for anyone who wants to get into OpenRGB. And then we also have a link to our Discord community here too. And unfortunately, we kind of took off on Discord. I wanted to move it over to Matrix, but that was going to be a hard sell to having an established community. I
Yep.
did though. I have gotten rid of the OpenRGB subreddit because of all the Reddit drama. So
Mm-hmm.
we are now on Lemmy
Awesome.
OpenRGB. So that's also on our website.
Sweet. Is that all you want to mention?
I think as far as getting in contact, that's probably the main stuff. So I think that's all.
Okay, cool. Um, As for me, if you are not subbed to the main channel, that is Brody Robertson. I do Linux videos there 6 days a week. I don't know what's going to be out by the time this comes out because I am way ahead of schedule. So, I don't know. Maybe Red Hat will do something stupid again. That's possible.
Yeah,
Uh,
maybe.
if you want to go see my gaming stuff, I do gaming or gaming streams 2 times a week on YouTube, Twitch, and Kick now as well. I'm playing through Yakuza 0, which may be done by the time that you guys see this. So I'll probably be playing Black Mesa then. And I'm also playing through Final Fantasy 16. If you're listening to the audio version of this, the video version is available on YouTube at Tech Over Tea. If you're watching the video, you can find the audio anywhere you can find an audio podcast. There's an RSS feed. Stick in your favorite app. I like AntennaPod. Yeah, that's going to be it for me. So I'll give you the final word. What do you want to say?
I want to say thank you for having me. This has been fun. This has
Absolute
been
pleasure.
interesting to talk about my project and do an interview like this. So it's been great, and getting the word out is always good. So
Awesome.
been a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, it's been absolute pleasure talking to you as well. I'm happy you decided to do this.
Yeah, for sure. I'm glad you reached out to me. So
well, I hope OpenPleb goes well. I hope OpenRGB goes well, and yeah, that I think is everything then. So I'm out.